So, good day, everyone. Today we have a great podcast with Ben Bikman, Professor Ben Bikman. He's a specialist when it comes to insulin and metabolic disorders. This podcast is quite long, but it has a lot of good information in it, and I think if you listen through this one, you will understand much more about insulin, a lot about more how your nutrition is and how your body works, basically a lot about when to eat, how to eat, a bit about training and nutrition, we also get into some philosophical questions too. He is a great guy, very sympathetic and intellectual honesty. I like that. So I encourage you to listen to this one, and let us know what you think about the episode. See you next time. Bye. One, two, three.
My name is Carl Powell.
I am Marco Casali.
I'm Lasse Rantala.
Carl Dial. I'm the
Escapist.
Hola, soy Marco Casali y ustedes están escuchando
In to the Escapist Corner. Moro! Rantala Lasse tässä terve. Sä kuuntelet Escapist Corneria.
Yeah, so welcome to the Escapist Corner. So, welcome, Ben. We chatted just before I said welcome, Ben. Ben Bikman, you're a professor at the BYU in Utah, and again, I'm very honored, flattered, and humbled to have such a bright mind on the podcast. And I just thought let's introduce you here maybe shortly. So, what's your elevator pitch?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for reaching out. This is a fun opportunity to speak with you. I am thrilled to be sharing more of this message on the dangers and awareness of insulin resistance and overall metabolic health anywhere in the world, Berlin included. That's a great audience. And in fact, someday, Richard, you're going to have to find a way to get me to Berlin. I've been to Germany a couple times, but I never made it to Berlin. So I got to get there sooner than later. So my background is looking at metabolic health, and it started actually in the context of exercise. My master's degree was exercise physiology, so studying how the body adapts to exercise. What are the cellular changes that the muscles go through, the heart, the lungs, the brain, in order to respond to the exercise and to be better able to do that same activity again in the future, this adaptation. But towards the very end of my master's degree, and in fact what ended up being my master's thesis, I actually started shifting towards looking at the connection between obesity and inflammation. And right at the time, a few years prior to my master's degree, there was, for me, what was a mind-blowing realization in human physiology. And that was that our fat cells actually make and release pro-inflammatory hormones. That was so shocking to me, the idea that our fat cells are endocrine or are hormone-releasing tissues, and some of these hormones are proteins that will cause inflammation throughout the body. So that was the beginning of me leaving exercise behind totally, professionally speaking, not personally. I'm still a big advocate of exercise, but I wanted to focus more and more on just fat tissue and obesity. And so during my PhD, I progressed looking more at how obesity connects to diabetes. And at the time, I was just thinking, I was looking at it because inflammation was sort of a mediator of that. The prevailing thought was at the time, and it still is a prevailing thought, someone has too much fat mass, the fat tissue is releasing pro-inflammatory proteins or hormones, and then this increased inflammation is then causing insulin resistance. That was the general idea that most people have, and I certainly had at the time. And it's not wrong. There's just more nuance to it. But nevertheless, I followed that up with a postdoctoral fellowship, continuing to look at this relationship between fat and inflammation and insulin resistance. And then I was hired here at BYU about 10 years ago. In fact, 10 years ago exactly, actually, as of July 1. So it's 1 decade now as a professor. And I've continued to look at insulin and mitochondrial function. And more over the past few years, I've started looking into ketones. And that was a bit of an evolution for me as I continued to understand and learn more about insulin and the dangers of too much insulin. The best way to combat that is to just lower insulin. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but so we can come back and touch on any of these things that you think we should. But the more I appreciated how bad it was to have high insulin, the more I appreciated how important it was to keep insulin low. And when insulin is low, the body starts making ketones. And so that got me interested in ketogenic diets or ketogenic states, where someone is controlling their insulin by controlling carbohydrates or by fasting, and then looking at these ketones as beneficial molecules themselves, because ketones are very beneficial. And we have studies coming out of my lab all the time. We have 2 studies that were just submitted for review, looking at ketones on fat tissue. One we're just about to submit, looking at ketones in the brain. Anyway, so that's my academic journey to where I am now.
Yeah, I think I have, when I prepared for this podcast, I think I've been into so many rabbit holes already with things I would like to talk about. But I think for the audience, like most of us kind of have heard about insulin. We have heard about maybe ketones or ketogenic diet and so on. But maybe we should just define or help the audience to understand what is insulin actually.
Perfect.
And what is the counterpart of insulin, glucagon.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so in fact, let's define insulin and then even insulin resistance and then glucagon, because I mentioned insulin resistance and someone might not really appreciate what that is. So insulin itself is a hormone that is released from a tissue in our bodies called the pancreas, an organ called the pancreas. Unless you're a type 1 diabetic, someone with type 1 diabetes has lost those cells on the pancreas that make insulin. But for everyone else, we have insulin flowing through our bloodstream all the time. One of the main actions of insulin is to keep blood glucose in control. So if we eat a starchy, sugary meal, we eat some bread or bagels or something, then our glucose levels will go up very high, very quickly. That, if it stays too high for too long, that is dangerous. In fact, even lethal. You can die if that stays too high for too long. And insulin comes in and saves the day. So our blood glucose levels come up, and then the pancreas will sense this increase in glucose, and it will release insulin. And then insulin will essentially open doors to muscle and fat cells to push the glucose, or to allow the glucose to come rushing into those cells. And so insulin helps the glucose go out of the blood and into the tissues, the muscle and the fat mostly, and then glucose comes down, and then insulin will come back down. When insulin is bumped up too high, too often, it can start to create a resistance. The cells of the body can start to become resistant to insulin. Now, there's a little more to it than this, but one simple version is as I'm describing. And so if someone's bumping up their glucose all the time because they follow conventional dietary advice, they're told to eat a high-carb diet and eat 6 times a day, or 6 meals or snacks or whatever, their glucose is constantly coming up, And insulin, of course, is coming up to push the glucose back down. Unfortunately, this process can take 2 to 4 hours depending on the person. So if a person wakes up and they have a bagel and orange juice for breakfast, that's going to really increase their glucose. Insulin will come up and it'll take about 3 hours to come back down to normal depending on the person. It can be as little as 90 minutes and if they're very healthy and lean. But let's say the person's a little overweight, they're kind of sedentary. It takes 3 hours for insulin to come back down. That's right when they bump it back up with a mid-morning snack. And then they bump it back up for lunch and then for afternoon snack and so on. That living a life where insulin is constantly elevated creates resistance to insulin. Now that is important because most people think of insulin and they just think of diabetes. And type 2 diabetes, which is the most common by far of type 1 versus type 2, is a state where insulin is always up. But it's important because before the person actually has type 2 diabetes, when they are just insulin resistant, it looks like this. They have high insulin, but it's enough insulin to keep the blood glucose levels normal. So they're going to their doctor and they're gaining weight, they have high blood pressure and maybe infertility or something like that, or fatty liver disease. And the doctor just looks at the glucose and the doctor will say, well, you're not diabetic, so you're okay. Just here's some blood pressure medication or something like that. And then I'll see you in a year. But if the doctor looked at the insulin level in that person with insulin resistance, which is called prediabetes, the insulin level may be sky high, but they just look at these problems as glucose problems. And so a lot of my professional goal is to try to say, hey, look at the insulin. And then if we look at the insulin, then the doctor would say, oh, glucose is normal, but we see that insulin is high. That's probably the cause of your high blood pressure and your infertility and your fatty liver disease. So rather than me give you a drug to treat your hypertension and your infertility, let's just lower your insulin. And then the patient would say, well, what's the best way to lower your my insulin? And the doctor says, well, just don't eat so many carbohydrates. And it works. It works extremely well. Insulin comes down, the insulin sensitivity starts to get better, and then so do all the problems that come from insulin resistance.
Yeah, there's many things to tap on there. First of all, I'm thinking, have you looked at any differences in insulin levels, glucose levels when it comes to different types of carbohydrates, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bet. So in general, the more natural the starch or the carbohydrate, the better it will be in general. So you can think of something as just sort of different steps away from its natural state. So if we have something that we literally are just eating it in the way it came, and then we change it one level, we change it another level, we change it another level. So for example, if someone eats a potato, that actually might not be that bad. If it's just a baked potato, they haven't done anything else, they just baked the potato, you could say that maybe that's one step changed, as opposed to something like a bagel, where that is, you've taken the wheat, you have now milled it or ground it up, and now you have baked it or something, or whatever. You have one or two more steps. In general, the more steps from natural, the higher the starch, the sugar content will be, and the higher the insulin response will be. But there are some exceptions. Nowadays, we've gotten so clever at making fruits and vegetables as sugary as possible. So something like a banana is or a pineapple, those are very sugary fruits. And even an apple nowadays, once upon a time, 60 years ago, apples were small little sour things. Now we've turned them into big sugar bombs. And so there is some kind of, my general view of how many steps removed doesn't always work, but my general rule is fruits and vegetables are going to be okay, and some are going to be better than others, but if we don't want to worry too much about defining them, we could just say fruits and vegetables are okay, but never blend them into juices. You just eat the fruit or the vegetable. And then grains, are typically going to be worse. Not all of them. Buckwheat is very different from wheat, which is different from rice. So there are differences there. But in general, if someone wants to be smarter about their starches, then my recommendation is focus on fruits and vegetables, and generally just avoid the tropical fruits, pineapples, mangoes, bananas, because they're kind of the worst, and anything else is going to be okay.
Yeah. It's interesting to when you look at these different compounds, and as you said, like when you do shakes and stuff like that out of fruits and stuff, and you kind of release all the fructose out of the fruits, and all the fiber kind of gets destroyed.
Yes.
And I know Robert Lustig is one of the big proponents of, like, speaking of, like, if you eat the fruit, eat the fruit, don't drink the fruit.
Yeah.
Because the fiber kind of protects your protects you from taking up that fructose. It just goes through the body instead.
That's right. And when you eat the fruit, the fiber also helps you stop eating sooner. Richard, if you and I wanted to eat apples and have an apple eating contest, we would eat 4 apples and we would be sick of them. We would not want another apple. We would be so sick of the apples. But if we were drinking apple juice, we could drink the fructose from 20 apples easily, and still want more, because we stripped out all the fiber, which is part of what's going into our guts, and it's partly what's saying I'm full, I'm done. But when it's just pure fructose and water, which is what we get when we're either juicing or even when we're blending, like you said, we destroy the fiber. It's not going to have the same effect. So yes, eat the fruit, don't drink it.
Yeah. And just because you said that, what makes a lot of sense is because we done some glucose testing here for our nutrition clients, and when we done like nutrition challenges and so on, we just, out of curiosity, we wanted to check their like fasting blood glucose. And I saw some people with exactly the syndrome of high blood pressure. However, the fasting glucose level was almost too low. Right? So it was like, for example, like 0.7 and so on. Maybe not like a super dramatic thing for some people that are fasted to see that. Like it's in that kind of range of acceptable area for some people. So it doesn't stick out that much. So I can see what you're talking about when the doctor looks at the glucose and it's like, okay, well, it's pretty low. So you don't have diabetes.
Yeah.
However, looking at like if you combine those two, the hypertension combined with the low blood sugar, it might be like, okay, we need to have some kind of red light, alarm light signaling here. Like, okay, let's check the insulin there. And I haven't checked that for us if we could have some kind of insulin testing. I don't even know how.
It's not easy. No, and that's one of the problems in this whole situation. I am a big advocate of measuring insulin and looking at the insulin, asking what the insulin levels are. But it's not easy to measure. In contrast, blood glucose levels, you can do that just with a little finger prick and a little glucose meter. Boom, you know what your blood glucose levels are. Because glucose, and same with ketones, those are nutrients, and it's easier for a nutrient, you just oxidize the nutrient on that teeny little strip that gets your little teeny blood sample. But when you're talking about a hormone, it doesn't work the same way. It's immediately more complicated, and that means you have to take an actual blood sample, take blood from the arm, send it to the lab, and then the doctor can tell you your insulin levels later. But sometimes that's a test that some doctors won't do, or some labs won't do. In the US, some people will worry that their insurance won't pay for it. And in other countries where it's more socialized medicine, they in Canada, for example, they won't do it. It's not something that's going to be covered by the socialized medicine, and so it's difficult. There's a hurdle there, and so usually the patient has to be so determined that they're willing to pay for it themselves. And it's not that expensive, but it is money that they have to pay.
Yeah. So if we look at insulin, we have different things that are affecting your insulin levels. We talked about carbs as one factor, but we also have different lifestyle factors to that. Maybe you can abbreviate a bit on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, so diet is the big one when it comes to controlling insulin, but there are other things that are not diet dependent, most especially two in particular. Two. One, let's say stress is one, and stress can encompass a lot. The biggest part of stress-induced insulin resistance is going to be poor sleep habits. If someone doesn't sleep well, even one night of a very disordered, disrupted, bad sleep, the next day the person will be insulin resistant. And this has been measured. Now, that doesn't mean they're on their way to type 2 diabetes. No, because give the person one good night of sleep the next night and they're back to normal and it's fine. But you could see that as a person continues to have bad sleep every night for a long time, that is going to add up to a very meaningful insulin resistance. And
that's why you shouldn't have kids.
Oh, believe me, my sleep is I remember, just 12 years ago, I slept mostly through the night in general, but not anymore. So I love my little children desperately, but oh boy, they've ruined me. But even if someone doesn't have kids, as you know, we are a world that is obsessed with constant entertainment. We always have our phones with us. We have such bad sleep hygiene where we're looking at our phone too late. We're eating too late into the night. And that is I know for me, that is the single most important variable, is that I can't go to bed with a full stomach. I have to have eaten my dinner almost no later than 6 o'clock and stop. And even when I eat my dinner, I cannot eat till I'm stuffed, till I'm really full. I have to just try to keep my dinner at a very modest portion. If I overeat, then I know I wear a ring to track my sleep at night. And it has been so illuminating to see that if I eat too late into the night, my heart rate stays elevated for far too long into the night, and my body temperature is too high as well, as my body's just working on digestion, and I just can't settle down and sleep. So nevertheless, all this stress is a big one, causing insulin resistance that might not have anything to do with diet. Then the second one is inflammation. And that is an interesting aspect because it touches on a lot of other lifestyle variables or conditions. If someone has an underlying autoimmune disease, for example, like they have rheumatoid arthritis, or they have psoriasis, a skin disease, whatever, or lupus, if someone has an autoimmune disease, that inflammation in the body, that activation of the immune system, can cause insulin resistance. Now, usually that cycles. Someone who has an autoimmune disease, the disease will be bad, and then it gets good, and then it gets bad, and then it gets good. The insulin resistance will follow the cycles of the autoimmune disease as well. Now, but even if someone has an illness, if they have an infection, like a COVID-19 infection, there is some speculation that when some people get a bad COVID-19 infection, it actually starts to cause diabetes. And then that's just because they start to become insulin resistant and the glucose levels climb. And so it starts to check the boxes of diabetes. So those are the three main pillars. It's nutrition, basically too much carbs. Although nowadays it's carbs and fat together, and that's a very bad combination. But it's too much carbs, it's too much stress, or too much inflammation.
Yeah, and that also highlights so many things that we see on a practical level when we talk to people is their sleep is often not great. And so something that we usually recommend, or I ask people like, how is your sleep? And they say, well, I'm a bad sleeper. I usually get to bed very late. And I can't train in the morning because I'm a bit sleepy in the morning and blah, blah, blah. So I usually tell these people to actually start training in the morning. So we get the cortisol levels up in the morning instead. And then hopefully they're so tired in the evening that they might fall asleep a bit earlier. And
I think I totally agree with that. To help start fostering good sleep habits, wake up and actually wake up, turn on the lights, get active, start moving. Don't just sort of shuffle through the home with all the lights off and the blinds closed. No, when you're waking up, make sure that light is hitting your eyes. Start moving around, and it starts the clock. Basically, it starts the clock, this rhythm in your body saying, I'm awake. And then when it does come time for evening, the sun is setting, lights are getting dim. Hopefully the person is shifting to eliminate blue lights on their phone or their screens or something, just to help that light start reducing to the eyes. And then it starts to tell the brain, I'm getting ready for sleep, and then they can sleep better. I think it's a brilliant idea. It's a good way to do it.
Yeah. And also like to tap into this kind of the autoimmune problems that follow along. My sense is that many of us have some kind of sensitivities to it. Can be different things, like somebody has sensitivities to gluten. Someone has to some different plastics, and to fruits, whatever, vegetables, and they have these kind of sensitivities, and they're kind of not so bad if everything else like their sleep is good, their exercise is good, and everything. However, when we then compile these things with just high insulin, right? So I'm thinking somebody who has like autoimmune system or autoimmune problems or disease, he might or she might really want to reduce all kind of excess insulin in the body, because this person might be having this high insulin, even though if we compare this person to the second person, they might eat the same amount of carbs, for example, but this guy who has more insulin resistance already because of his autoimmune disorder, he might just not tolerate as much carbs as this.
I absolutely agree. We need to look at a person with this sort of constellation of variables, their underlying metabolic health from a genetic standpoint. Some people genetically just are more insulin sensitive than other people. People will have more of a sensitivity to certain foods around them. What's interesting about autoimmune diseases, and this is a bit of a tangent, so I won't go too far, but there's always an environmental trigger. It's a combination of someone having a genetic predisposition, and then they're exposed to something in their environment that turns it on, that makes this become a problem. And I think what you said is pretty accurate, that many people will have, not that it will necessarily cause an autoimmune disease, but many people will have some sensitivity to something. It just, whether it's maybe, like some of the things you mentioned, it's a grain sensitivity, or it's a dairy sensitivity, whatever it may be, it might be subtle enough to some people where maybe they eat this stuff and they find that they get kind of rashy skin, or they eat it and they get congested in their nose, or a sore throat or something. What's so interesting about all of that is that it's never meat. It is as far as I know, and I'm pretty confident in stating this, no one ever has a sensitivity to meat. This is such an ancestrally vital food as a species that it doesn't happen. And that, I think, is part of the benefit when certain people go to a pure meat-based diet. And I'm not advocating that necessarily. I'm not, but I have seen it too many times to ignore, where someone will have a debilitating disorder. They have a chronic inflammatory bowel disease, or they have a chronic inflammatory skin disorder, or whatever it may be, and it is totally gone. And I don't think it's because, maybe it's two things. One, meat, or beef especially, is very nutritious. It is a very nutritious food. But second, they have just ended up eliminating these foods that they didn't know they had a sensitivity to, just because they went to the most fundamental nutritious food and built their entire nutrition on that. And the health, again, I've seen it too many times to ignore. It is incredible what that shift can do. So all to your point, that there are sensitivities to foods, and sometimes people may not know even that they have a sensitivity to a food. They might just think, I just got unlucky genetically. I have a chronic inflammatory disease. There's nothing to do about it. Actually, there is. It's probably triggered from a food you're eating.
Yeah, this is called epigenetics, right? So where, and also something I talk about to people is like, yeah, you might have these genetics, like your dad was this, your mother was that, and your granddad and whatever. And that's true that this kind of diet or this kind of sources might, it can be plastic, it can be something environmental that just triggers this gene to kind of go on. And for some people, it might just be that this gene is on. So you have this autoimmune disease, and the only thing you can do is to just mitigate all the other stresses.
Mm-hmm.
So the body has, and this is kind of how I see it, like you have this amount of defense in your body, like,
Mm-hmm.
and if you have like some kind of disease that is very hard for your body, you will need all your troops to kind of mitigate and fight that disease. And then you have, but if you start to add new fronts, like we think of it like a war, and you start to add the Eastern Front and the Western Front to that, your troops has to divide.
Yep.
And
just one too many attacks on the body.
Yeah. I don't know if that analogy like really holds, but that's kind of how I've been trying to looking at it. And especially when you look at these like real high restriction diets. We had Dr. Sean Baker also on the show, and we talked about that. Like this is a very restrictive diet when you only eat meat, but it definitely, if you have any kind of problems, this will be at least a very good way to kind of see if it's in the food, or you're going to have a bit more chance to kind of get some kind of space and breathe and try to fight that kind of disease. Or if you have, just having a inflammation from, we say, a cut or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I agree.
And one of my coaches, Mark here, he wanted to ask you, is there, well, maybe we should go and define this first, but he would like to know a bit about like keto and insulin resistance, if there are people that are in the ketogenic state that also get insulin resistant.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you're asking that question.
But before we go down that path, maybe we just try to define also, because again, a lot of people heard about ketogenic and ketogenic diets and ketones, but maybe you can help us to understand what ketones are, and also kind of what the ketones does to our different, as you call, brown and white fats. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let's start. Ketones, the simplest way of defining a ketone is that it is a little piece of fat. In fact, literally it is. If you look at the fat molecule, it's a long string of carbons. And what we've done is just pull off a little piece And that is the ketone. Just pull off two little carbons, two little carbons, two little carbons. And that's the kind of backbone of the ketone. Now, importantly, to back up a little bit, ketones are only made when the body is burning a high amount of fat. And that can only happen when insulin is low. Insulin is this master metabolic regulator, and the human metabolism is like a hybrid engine. And there's two main fuel sources that are fueling the body at any moment in varying levels, and that is glucose and fat. And insulin dictates which energy is being used. If insulin is high, then the body's in glucose burning mode. If insulin is low, the body is in fat burning mode. If insulin is low for a long enough time, and this is maybe around 20 hours, 16 to 20 hours in most people, then the body has been burning so much fat for so long that now it starts pushing some of that fat into turning it into ketones. And that serves a lot of purposes, but one of the primary purposes is to feed the brain. Because if we've stopped eating glucose, then the body is thinking, okay, I need to keep the brain fed, and because I'm getting low on glucose, I have this gap of energy, then ketones start to fill that gap. So that's probably the main purpose for making ketones. It's a way to feed the brain. Now, so that's how we make ketones, and that's why if someone is following a low carbohydrate diet or they're intermittent fasting, their insulin has been low enough for a long enough time that they're making a lot of ketones, and now they've entered into a state called ketosis. Ketosis is simply when blood ketones are higher than the typical person. And the typical person, again, as we talked about earlier, because their insulin is high all day long, they usually will have almost no detectable ketones. In fact, it will be below the level of detection on conventional, blood finger ketone measurements, measuring a drop of blood from the finger. And that actually has problems because if someone has a brain that needs more energy than the glucose can give, and that can happen in migraine headaches and epilepsy, then if they don't have any ketones, then the brain just goes hungry, and that causes some of the brain problems. So you only make ketones when insulin is low. Ketones themselves are little pieces of fat. Now, a paper that we have in review for publication right now shows that ketones can provide a bit of a metabolic advantage. There have been other scientists that have shown that when insulin is low compared to when insulin is high, metabolic rate is almost 300 kilocalories more per day. That is a lot. That's like an hour-long workout in some people. And to think about that, that's a metabolic advantage, because to get that 300 calorie boost, that increased metabolic rate in the body, we don't have to have the person exercise. We just keep their insulin low. Our paper finds that when ketones are elevated, it's actually shifting metabolism in fat cells. So mostly the fat that someone has on their bodies is mostly a type of fat called subcutaneous fat. And that's the fat that's right beneath the skin, the fat that we can pinch and jiggle on our belly and our legs and our arms. That subcutaneous fat is called white fat, and it really is just storage fat. It's just to pull in energy and store it for to be used later, hopefully, although most people never use their energy because they're always eating. We have some spots on our body that is called brown fat, and that's mostly just up here on the upper chest and around the shoulders. That brown fat is in fact brown in color, and it has a very high metabolic rate. It has lots of mitochondria, and these mitochondria are eating lots of glucose and fat just to make more heat. So it's very thermogenic, we say. Now, what's interesting about ketones is that ketones actually start converting a little bit. It starts converting some of that white subcutaneous fat that we can pinch and jiggle. It starts making it act more like brown fat. And thus, it's increasing the metabolic rate. And so what we found in humans is that when humans were in ketosis, and we were pulling fat biopsies from fat right beside their belly button. So belly fat, we were just doing a little cut and going in and pulling out a little piece of fat. And we found that the metabolic rate in the fat tissue went up from 2 to 3 times higher than the normal person when they were not in ketosis. So that's a very real metabolic benefit of having higher ketones. Now, in this state of prolonged ketosis, where a person is eating very little carbohydrate, because that has to happen, whether it's because they're fasting or whether it's because it's a low carb diet, what those have in common is that they're not eating carbohydrates. And so ketones can get very, very high. And the body has shifted really to a fat burning state. Very little glucose burning, very high fat burning. And of course that makes sense, because the person is eating fat or they're burning their own stored body fat, which is why it's there. So we need to burn it and use it. And because they're not eating glucose, they're not burning much glucose. Glucose burning is very, very low. Now, however, but importantly, Richard, and this is so important, insulin is low. And that right there is very, very important, because sometimes people want to say this state of very high fat burning and very little sugar burning, they say that's physiological insulin resistance. No, that is not true. That is false, because insulin resistance can only happen when insulin is high. And importantly, so Richard, people will say that's insulin resistance because if they're high fat burning, very low sugar burning, if they immediately dump lots of sugar into the body, like they eat a bagel or they drink juice or something, then that glucose will go up and it will take longer than normal to come back down. It will take longer than normal. But that does not mean they're insulin resistant, because if I gave that person an injection of insulin, it would work very, very well. Their glucose levels would go even lower than before, and it'd be very dangerous. They're very insulin sensitive. It's just they've adapted. Their metabolism has adapted to fat burning, and now when we force it to go right back to sugar burning very, very quickly, it takes a little time for the body to adjust. And so if someone has been adhering to a ketogenic diet and they have to go to the doctor and do an oral glucose tolerance test, they should know they will fail the test probably if they just go straight in. They need to get the body back to burning carbohydrates about 2-3 days before, start eating more carbohydrates just to help the body start going back and forth to be more flexible again. And then they will be just fine. But that state of high fat burning, low glucose burning, that is called a glucose intolerance, or I've heard people say that's adaptive glucose sparing. The body's using so little glucose because it doesn't have a lot, and so it doesn't want to use a lot. And so even when you load it in, the body is still thinking, I should be very careful and not use too much, because it just takes some time for the body to go back to sugar burning mode when it's been in fat burning mode for so long. So that is not the same as insulin resistance. Whether insulin resistance is pathological, like a person who's overweight and high blood pressure, or whether it is physiological, like pregnancy and puberty, those are the 2 times of physiological insulin resistance where the body is insulin resistant, but it is insulin resistant for a purpose, to help growth or to help a baby grow. What they have in common is that insulin levels are high. So always, a person is only insulin resistant if insulin is high, and then it's not working particularly well in normal places. That's the difference between pathological and physiological. But what they have in common is that insulin is high. On a low carb or ketogenic diet or fasting, insulin is low. That is not insulin resistance. It is just a glucose intolerance. They just need to kind of warm that system back up to get back into sugar burning mode.
Yeah. Oh man, I have so many things I go through my head when we talk about this, but I'm thinking if you eat, for example, high amounts of fat, what I've also understood is this will also keep your insulin levels elevated for a longer period, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Have you any knowledge about that?
Yeah. So you're asking with dietary fat that will keep insulin high?
Yeah, exactly.
No, it won't. There is very, very little evidence to support that, but there is some. So in general, if someone eats, it's sort of like a threshold. If someone eats maybe 600 calories, 600 calories of fat, then insulin will be very, very, very low, and it'll come up a little bit about an hour or two and come back down. But in some studies, that little bit can be called statistically significant. It will get a significant p-value, but it's still very, very modest. If someone eats less than that, 200 or 300 calories of fat, nothing. There's no significant difference. Now, some of this could be the amount of fat. It could be the type of fat, possibly milk fat, because it has so much different types of fats. Maybe that has a bigger effect than just coconut oil, which is a much narrower range of fats, or even olive oil, which is even narrower than coconut oil. So there may be some nuance there, but in general, dietary fat is not going to increase insulin, perhaps unless it gets to a much higher level, like 500 or 600 calories. But even then, it's still very, very small.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And I know, I mean, I don't think this is so much for our audience, but I know for some of the guys that are going for the ketogenic diet, they're some of them are scared about eating protein and so on. And we, I mean, usually what I say and look at is like, what we look at first of all is like, do you eat enough protein? And because that is kind of the first thing we want to get into the body in enough states, and also looking at the amount of protein that is needed also over time. So over your age.
Yeah, over lifetime.
Over lifetime, it's going to change, and I guess also for all the other variables will start to change. Like I assume your insulin sensitivity and everything will start to change as you get older. And just because of DNA degeneration and all the things.
And muscle loss, and bad sleep. Typically, as we age, we stop sleeping quite as well as when we were younger. Yeah, so I agree completely. Protein should not be vilified. It should not be looked at as an enemy on a ketogenic diet. I don't think that is warranted. It's not fair. It's not healthy. My thoughts on protein is that God made fat and protein come together. The best protein sources have fat with them. Whether it is dairy or whether it is meat or eggs, fat and protein come together all the time. That's how we should eat them. And now if someone has to stay in ketosis because of a medical condition, like let's say someone has an epilepsy disorder, and if they go out of ketosis, they will start to get seizures. That can happen. In that person, I would say, okay, maybe be a little more careful with protein, because protein can have an insulin effect. That is absolutely true. It can. For the average person, I say, who cares? If the protein effect from the insulin effect from protein, it's going to be small. And it's okay if it lowers your ketones for a little bit. It's okay. That's just insulin telling the protein where to go, and basically to build up and help the body with muscle. So let it happen. It's okay in the average person. But importantly, if someone's adhering to a low carbohydrate diet, there are two important things. One, the insulin effect of the protein will be less than it would be if someone's adhering to a high carbohydrate diet. So if someone's eating glucose and protein, which in nature doesn't come together, that's very uncommon. It's basically just milk. Pure milk is high in all three, sugar, protein, and fat. And that's perfect because we give it to a little baby, and that's a wonderful cocktail to help baby grow as quickly as possible. That's really the only instance of carbohydrate and protein coming together. in high amounts. But nevertheless, if someone's eating protein and carbohydrate together, that will have a bigger insulin effect. If it's protein and fat, or just protein alone, and it's low carb, the person's not eating carbohydrates, it will have a smaller insulin effect. And then earlier, at the very beginning of our conversation, you mentioned a protein called glucagon, a hormone called glucagon. What's important in a low carbohydrate diet, when someone eats protein, insulin will go up, but the glucagon comes up with it. And glucagon is kind of insulin's opposite. Whereas insulin wants to inhibit ketone production, glucagon activates ketones. Where insulin wants to tell a fat cell to store energy and get big, glucagon wants to tell the fat cell to share the fat and get small, so to release fat. And so there's these contrasting effects of these two hormones. So again, on a low carb diet, when someone eats protein, they both go up. So glucagon can offset some of the negative of the insulin. On a high carbohydrate diet, it goes opposite. Then insulin goes up and glucagon goes down, putting the body into energy storage rather than energy use, because glucagon wants the body to use energy, not store it.
Yeah. And would you say when you eat a lot of, well, let's say you are on a ketogenic diet or you are very low carb, you get insulin sensitive instead, and would you say this is also might be a problem for people that they simply come out of the kind of low carb and then they kind of transition to a normal life or standard diet again, and then they just start growing?
Yep. They will gain it all back. That's one of the sad things that too few people realize, that they've gained weight, they've become unhealthy, they adopt a ketogenic diet and they get healthy and they lose weight. The myth is thinking, okay, now I can go back to eating how I was before and stay that same healthy, lean way. No. If they go back to those same habits, they go back to the same body. And so unfortunately, a person who makes lifestyle changes to get healthier, they have to maintain those lifestyle changes to keep that health. Now, what someone might be able to do is they lose 100 pounds and they get off medications and diabetes gets better. What they can start to do is sort of start to put carbs back in a little bit at a time and just see, okay, I've been eating 50 grams of carbohydrates. Now for a week or 2 weeks, I'm going to go up to 75 grams and just see, can I stay where I am? And if they notice, I'm starting to gain weight, then they know they have to go back down if they want to stay where they were. Or if they find that they can go back up in carbs and the body is still healthy and they feel fine, then okay, that can be a new normal. And they can even try pushing it up again in 2 more weeks, and just to start experimenting what happens as they start to go a little bit back to where they were. But the great myth is that someone makes a change, they get better, and they think they can go back to the old habits and stay better. No. If they go back to old habits, the bad health will come back too.
Yeah. So if we go then to the question that Mark had about the being in a ketogenic state, and is there a risk of getting insulin resistance by actually eating the wrong fats?
Only if it is maybe, and only if it would be like soybean oil or fake fats. If it is a natural fat, or what I like to say an ancestral fats, so fats that we as humans have been eating for thousands or millions of years, animal fats are good, any animal fat, and then fruit fats are good. And the fruit fats are coconuts, olives, avocados, basically where the fat is coming from the flesh of the fruit, not from the seed. If it's seed fat, like soybean oil is the most common, or canola oil or corn oil, those are not good. Those are very refined, and they're high in a type of fat called linoleic acid, which in low levels is everywhere. It's in every animal fat, for example, so you can't avoid it. And you don't need to. You need it And so it's fine. Only get it when it comes from animal sources because it's so low. Nowadays, unfortunately, in the US, and I suspect Germany is very, very close to this, soybean oil is the number one source of fat in the diet because almost every processed food, if someone's eating food from a package, that fat is almost always going to be soybean oil. Here in the US, and again, I bet Germany's close, if you go to a supermarket, a grocery store, and you try to find salad dressing without soybean oil, impossible. Soybean oil is in all of them. You try to, one of my daughters loves ketchup. Even ketchup has soybean oil. Mayonnaise, soybean oil. It is everywhere. It is the number one consumed fat in the Western diet.
Yeah, I think in Germany, what we mostly see is sunflower oil.
Yep, same.
Loads of it. And especially, this is the funny caveat, is that if you go to any supermarket here in Germany and you want to buy any meat product that is, I would say, it's processed in some way. And if it's cheap, then it's always going to be in sunflower oil and I'm blanking on the English word for raps or raps oil. I don't know what that is in English.
Rapeseed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Those two, they combine in everything. So if you buy tuna, for example, the cheap tuna in oil is always with the sunflower oil or
yeah, that's too bad. And the problem with putting those oils in with meat is that you're going to cook the meat, and then those are oils you do not want to heat up because those are polyunsaturated fats, and those do not heat well. They become very like radical or lipid peroxides, very damaging molecules that actually can make the body sick in any number of ways, including insulin resistance. So that's doubly unfortunate because that you have to get the meat with those fats. That's bad. And when you cook the meat, which you always will do, you heat it up, and those oils are not very stable. They heat and they become radical, and they're very unhealthy, as opposed to something like coconut oil, which is the most stable. That's one of the great misfortunes with people look at like coconut oil as such a demon. If you are going to heat up the oil to a high temperature, coconut oil is number one. It's the best.
Yeah. I think also olive oils have different qualities too, but I usually also say you never want to have oils exhausting fumes. That's like a bad idea. But looking at especially these, as you said, and then we look into people cooking, you said meat and these oils, but looking at doing refined carbs and these oils too.
Oh, double whammy. Yes, very bad.
Or potato chips, and
potato
stuff like
chips, French fries.
Yeah.
When you're frying something, a carbohydrate in those oils, that's the worst. That's like a perfect storm. And usually they will add sugar of some kind too. So now you have the heated refined oil, you have the refined carbohydrate, and you have sugar. That's the worst thing in the world.
And this is exactly what most people feed their kids.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's what treats are, because they're delicious. It's delicious. It like satisfies every part of your brain. If you eat something with those three things, something that is fried, a carbohydrate that is fried and has sugar, it's amazing. It's so yummy. Like a donut. A donut, it's so delicious, but it is the worst thing.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing about that is that kids are, kids are just monsters in bouncing back from anything. So, for example, my kid has an injury, or she scrapes her knee or anything. It takes her like 2 days and then it's gone.
Oh, yeah.
So the body is healing so fast in kids. So that's why it is even more disturbing when you see kids being obese.
Oh, I know.
Because that tells you how much you have to actually be or almost
abusing
that kid. So
it's very sad. I see an overweight child and I feel bad for the child because I don't often say this kind of thing, but I will here. In my mind, it is not the child's fault. A little kid doesn't appreciate nutrition and that they should be eating less sugar. If mom and dad are buying those foods and bringing them into the house and letting the child eat them, that's mom and dad's fault, because mom and dad know better. Mom and dad should be treating that child better. I don't blame the child. A kid is going to eat junk food. It's just they don't know what is going to be the healthier food or the unhealthy food. If mom and dad,
it's the easy way out, as I say. And something that life has told me is that the easy way out is usually not the long-term best way. So
you have to, that's like you have to put that on a poster in the CrossFit gym. otherwise no one comes.
I wanted to also ask you a bit about insulin and training, because I know that like insulin, when you're in a low carb state, your insulin is low. And if I'm correct, when your insulin is low, your ATP, as we talked about, or your metabolic rate is higher. And how or what is your kind of thoughts about training and the low insulin levels? Because as you said, like the mitochondria is really upping up its work a bit when the insulin levels are low. But when they're high, the mitochondria is actually less active. So how does that kind of relate to fitness? Because most people within fitness, classical fitness at least, they are like, you have to have carbs. You have to have carbs. And for muscle growth and so on. And I saw you talk to Stan Effertrain, right? Am I correct? Yeah. So I know he has this vertical diet, but I'm not super. I don't know too much about it, but I know he is also a bit of a pouring in some carbs with protein, but never together with fat. So
So I don't know Stan's diet too well either, but I will say it's working for Stan. and, so I don't in any way intend to criticize his system, because the results speak for themselves. But I will also say that when you're training at a very, very high level, you can get away with a lot of things that I don't think should be applied to the average person who's just sort of casually exercising for 30 minutes a day. That person is going to have a very different nutritional need than the person who's hard, intense weightlifting for 1 hour or 2 hours, whatever, going failure on every set. That is such a different situation. Now, the evidence that carbohydrates and protein together is better is very weak. For example, there's one very specific study. They took men and they had them exercise, and they were in two groups. One group just got a load of protein. One group got a load of protein with pure carbohydrate, dextrose. They looked at the main outcome, they would pull a muscle biopsy and look at the rate at which the muscle was making new protein. And that's called muscle protein synthesis. I consider it the best single indicator of muscle growth. So in the group of men that exercised and got protein alone, there was a significant increase in muscle protein synthesis. In the group of men that got protein and carbohydrate, it was exactly the same. It did not go any higher. It was exact same. So the protein and carbohydrate did not get any more muscle benefit. Even though the insulin effect would be higher, it's because it's not just a matter of insulin. It isn't. In fact, I've heard some people say, and I like this description, insulin doesn't build muscle, it just protects muscle.
Mm.
And so, and who knows what that level needs to be. So the person who's low carb and eats protein, they get a little insulin bump. That is obviously enough to protect the muscle, as opposed to going 2 times higher in insulin. That's just extra. We didn't need that. The muscle didn't need it. You went higher. Now you're just feeding fat cells. We didn't need to get that high.
Yeah.
Now, in contrast, Richard, and I think this touches on nature and human evolution and nutrition, where earlier I said fat and protein come together, and I believe that's for a reason. One reason is that fat and protein help protein work better. A different study looked at the same thing, but just flipped out the carbs for fat. The protein alone had a significant effect. The protein and fat, even higher. It was significantly higher than just the protein alone. So there's something about that fat, either improving amino acid absorption or uptake into the cell or something. I don't know the process, but I know the data said that when you have protein and fat together, and they did what I consider a divine ratio, because they matched what you have in an egg. In an egg, which I think is a perfect food, by mass, not by calorie number, but by mass, the fat and the protein is 1 to 1.
Yeah.
You know, like 3 grams, something like that. And there is something, that's what they did in this study. And so to me, that creates a kind of a rule, a pillar for optimal nutrition, that it ends up being a calorie breakdown of about, 60, like kind of 65 to 35%, 65%-ish fat, 35% from protein. That's about what you get when it's a 1 to 1 by mass. And I think that's a very, very good macronutrient breakdown.
Yeah. And I know, so I know there was some study also, I don't know exactly when it came out, but it was people riding bikes and they changed their diet. Was like a very poor study if you look into it a bit more detail, but it basically had this group being, if I recall correctly, they were doing low carb, and then they cycled, and then they were let's say, no, it was vice versa. They were eating carbs, and then they took away the carbs and tried to go kind of low carb, and they tried to do this same test of biking. And it was, I don't know, it was like a 2-hour ride or something like that.
But they had no period, no adaptation.
No adaptation. When we talked about this, like metabolic flexibility to make your body able to actually adapt to that. And at the same time, also, I think in that study, like the difference in those times between those, so I think the same person did it, right? So between those times, like there was not really a significant difference between the results. However, there was a tiny difference, but I mean, again, like the other factors, like how was your sleep? Did your wife yell at you yesterday? But also,
that's right. Yeah. And we both know that can happen. What is so important, and I wouldn't want someone to misunderstand me, I am an advocate for a low carbohydrate diet in people that are worried about their metabolic health. So someone who wants to stay lean or is trying to get lean, someone who's worried about their blood pressure or worried about their headaches or their fertility or their fatty liver disease, low carb diet will work every time.
Yeah.
If we're talking about an athlete, well, then that's a different set of rules. And I would still say, I still believe that you have someone like Sean Baker or Zach Bitter who are very ends of on the spectrum, where Sean Baker is a power athlete, Zach Bitter is an endurance athlete. And Zach Bitter is an interesting case because he will live a low carbohydrate diet, but when he trains, he will add carbohydrates into his training. And of course, Zach is an extreme example because he will go run, 150 kilometers or something crazy. Yeah. But what I mean to say is that if someone has a high demand and an athletic demand, they're like doing CrossFit for 1 hour every day, I would say, yeah, you maybe need some carbs, do what you need to do to just feel good and get your workout done as high power as you can. But then for the rest of the day, if you want to stay lean and keep a six pack, well, then you don't need all the carbs for the rest of the day. Focus low carb. But during the exercise itself, maybe there's a reason to have carbs. I don't know enough about that, but it makes sense to me. I would be okay with that.
Yeah.
Now, for me,
Hmm.
I'm a middle-aged man. I just want to stay lean, and I don't work out that hard. I work out about 30 to 45 minutes a day, and it's just pure body weight exercises, pure calisthenics. I do not spike carbs into my workout. I just don't need it. It's not a high enough intensity.
I think it's a good point. I see it also in that way. Like you have CrossFit, we say weightlifting, for example. The guys who do professional Olympic weightlifting, it doesn't matter if you're broken at 30 or at 35. Like your goal is to get to the Olympics and be the best. Any shortcut, any way. If your mobility sucks in some part, but you don't have time to fix that before the competition, you're gonna try to get more muscle mass or whatever it might be, or work on your power, and you're just gonna live with, okay, I'm gonna kind of be I'm gonna sacrifice my tendons so I can do this lift.
Yep.
And we see this all the time, like the weightlifters, they're going broken. We see long endurance athletes burning out, and it's a different thing. We're looking at the end of the spectrum where you're doing everything. I mean, if you look at cycling, they're basically doing everything that you shouldn't, that isn't even allowed, to make those results happen. But again, for longevity, it's a different ball game. And the same thing is when it comes to, you do CrossFit or you eat for what are you eating? And I'm thinking like, what are you training CrossFit? It's not, we're not going to the CrossFit Games. We're okay. It's cool to be able to do handstand walks and to, be able to squat twice your body weight, or
and to make it practical, it's cool to be able to easily get off the ground. It's cool to be able to pick up your child and play with your child, or so for me, exercise is always a means to an end. Not always, often it's a means to an end. How can I be more physically capable in my life? And then is what I'm doing, my physical activity, my exercise, is that helping me be more physically capable? Am I going to be a better husband and a better father and care for my home and care for my family? That's a goal. That's kind of main goal. And then I want to look good. Yes, sure. Yeah. But that's not as important as feeling good and moving well.
Yeah. I totally agree there. I want to be respectful of your time. However, I have some small, I don't know if there are shorter questions, but I'm thinking when you're a scientist and a researcher, and this has been, I follow Brett Weinstein and some of these intellectuals, and Sam Harris, and they talk about like how flawed the science is, and we look into nutritional science. This is, and we look at specifically like the sugar science, the science of sugar, where we have half of the studies out there are funded by sugar companies.
Yeah, and they all show positive, good results for the sugar.
Yeah, and so my thought, my question to you is like, so Ben, if you had all the money in the world, what kind of research, like what kind of studies would you start doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a great question. I would, I would do more clinical studies like ones we've talked about, mixing macronutrients, even mixing different types of fat, different sources of carbohydrates, different sources of proteins, and have it be double blind, and then just show the data for what they are. I appreciate all those names you mentioned, the Weinsteins and Sam Harris, Weinsteins in particular, because I feel like a kind of kinship with them, although I don't share all the same political, not all the same political thoughts, but I am very big on liberty, on freedom. And I'm also very much a religious person too, but I'm a very rational religious person. I have a very firm belief in God, in a higher power, but I also have a very great belief in human capability, in human development. And so one of the challenges a scientist has is to not be married to an idea. That a scientist is a seeker of truth. And one big problem comes when a scientist has an ulterior motive, where they need the data to fit a narrative, to fit a story. They need to manipulate the truth to be one thing, and rather than let the truth be what it is. Often I will say that a scientist, it's cool, it's great to being a scientist because I get paid to be curious. But I shouldn't let my curiosity be overrun by an idea, by a dogma, a belief in what should be. That's one of the problems with science. And one of the problems too nowadays, at the risk of really going off topic here, as people start to lose a belief in a higher power, and I don't mean that in a condemning way, but I do get a little afraid if they don't have faith in a higher power or a moral authority, then they put all their faith in science, and that kind of becomes their God. And then scientists are like the priests of that new religion. And I think that just creates too much power for the scientist, and then it potentially corrupts the scientist who was once very innocent and just curious. Now they have an ego, and they have their own kind of following, and that's dangerous. I worry a little bit when I see that happening.
I think it's I can see what you mean, and it's definitely the case when it comes to science. But this is also why I like science. Science will continue to try to improve and change,
Yeah.
if it's right, and it will always correct itself. And this is one of the main reasons why I'm not religious, is because that has not been the case in many religions over the time. So I know there are progressive religious people and so on, and I respect that, just like I respect any other person. But again, just hanging up, let's say, put the scientist on the altar is not gonna be the solution. However, I like if it's done correctly, the scientist will always have self-doubt.
Yeah, that's right.
And he will always be open, just like I'm trying to be as open as I can with our training too, and with our methods and so on. Is there a way to improve this? Like,
yes.
Is this really the best way? What if we do like 20 reps of this, or maybe we change that to 10 reps? What happens?
I totally agree. That is the mark of a humble person, and that's the difference, Richard. So what you're describing is to me is humility, where the person never thinks, I know it all and I'm done. But that's what you see happening in science, in certain realms, especially in nutritional science, that they think that the philosophy that they adopted 60 years ago, that low-fat diet is best and that saturated fat is the devil, it's done. there's no more science. We don't want to see it. That is ego. That is when their pride or their ego or their conviction for one idea has eliminated all other options. That is the mark of a person who will not ever learn and become as great as they could be, and it is the mark of a very bad scientist. A scientist has to, at any moment, be prepared to dump every hypothesis that they thought. If they see the data start to challenge the idea, they need to be mentally nimble or flexible enough to realize that. But that requires some humility, because that means I don't know everything.
Yeah, I think Sam Harris always talks about intellectual honesty. So
he's a good example of someone who finds a moral framework in the absence, to him, of deity. So that there's a moral framework just sort of that people will naturally come to. And I respect that. I am religious, and so I see a different version of this. But even still, this is a person that I could live in a community with and be comfortable that we're going to be humble, honest, and have the interests of our fellow man at the top.
Yeah, I think are you interested in having meaningful conversations? And I think that's a very important trait, and something, especially now in this day and age of social media, and everything is happening so fast. We just went through like the biggest shock in the CrossFit community.
Right.
And all due to this social media.
One tweet. Yep.
Yeah, it has been a roller coaster, right? And I think this is just lack of conversation. I see like someone like Jocko Willink on Joe Rogan. He's basically saying the same. It's like what is happening in the US right now with everything is just there's no communication. Everyone, like if you're the chief of police, if you're the president or whatever, you have to be there and communicate and go there on the ground, not distance yourself. And
people have forgotten one of the fundamental rules of communication, and that is, and I'll say this in a kind of clever way, but it is to seek first to understand and then to be understood. So we just want to be heard, but we don't want to hear. We don't want to listen to someone else. And that is a very sad way things are going. And social media makes that worse, because you just want to push your own thoughts out there. You don't care to hear what someone else is telling you back.
Yeah, I think Twitter is the worst there. I think I posted, I don't post anything more or less, but I've sometimes commented like wanted to give someone like my honest best, just pure willingness to help someone, and I get kicked in the mouth from someone else.
Yeah, it's just terrible. It really is. It is really just an opportunity for people to get upset. And that's kind of a new normal nowadays. People want to be angry. They want to be offended. They want to be upset. They don't want to try to understand each other, because if they try to understand the other person, they would have to recognize that this is a real person. They have real thoughts and real feelings, and then they can't be so angry at them. People want to be angry, and that's a very dangerous, sad trend nowadays. And in the US, we're seeing that massively right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think this is going to be the last point, but we have the corona. We touched a bit on the corona thing, but I think there's something in this that you've been talking about with the insulin and metabolic disorder and a virus like COVID-19, because my thought is this. So we see obese people are dying. People with preconditions are dying more easily. But then there are these cases where people say like, hey, this totally good-looking person got sick and died, or is very, very bad. And as I see it, it's like two reasons, or maybe it's only one reason actually. And I got this a bit from watching again Robert Lustig, and he talked about like this huge group of people that is not obese but have metabolic disorder because they have because of bad diet more or less. And we don't see this from the outside, but their insulin and inflammation state in the body is super high, but their body doesn't work that well with the storage maybe.
Yeah. So this study was, there was a very compelling study published in a very good journal based on the data that we were seeing in the US from New York. And I strongly suspect we would see similar data across the world with who is getting infected, and it's a bad infection when they get COVID-19, that they have to go to the hospital. 94%, so over more than 9 in 10 people, 94% of everyone who gets infected, and it's a bad infection, has a pre-existing condition. And the top 3 pre-existing conditions: obesity, hypertension, diabetes. That is the metabolic syndrome. That is insulin resistance, frankly. And in fact, 88% of all people had 2 or more of these problems. And again, the top 3 by a wide margin: obesity, hypertension, diabetes. So if someone's claiming, oh, this was a young, healthy person, I would say be skeptical of who is saying that. And did you actually confirm that this is a young, healthy person? Is it that they're young, healthy because you just see their face from a social media post? How are they? We don't know anything else about the person. Just because they look healthy from the neck up, we don't really know. But I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying it's impossible. It can happen.
I don't know many or very few examples, but one that I thought about and that made me a bit more cautious was again Sam Harris. He talked about his friend who is, this kind of fit guy, very active, skiing. He went to Italy skiing, came back, had COVID, and was hospitalized. And I'm thinking, someone like Sam Harris sees this guy, because this guy, he's active, he's not obese, but again, as most intellectuals, like even someone like Sam Harris that is knows a lot about a lot, many of the intellectuals out there have very poor understanding when it comes to nutrition.
Oh yes.
So my line of thought, it was that, okay, Sam Harris, you don't know so much about your friend's diet, maybe. Yep. You don't know about, does he have like hypertension? He might look skinny, he might be active and everything, but he might have all these metabolic underlying disorders that we can't see from the outside. And this is kind of the dangerous population, because they're walking around thinking everything is fine. And then suddenly they start to feel like an epiphany feeling, and then they drop dead.
Oh, yeah. And most people in the U.S., 88% of all U.S. adults have some feature of the metabolic syndrome. I mean, that 88% of U.S. adults, that is a shocking number. Yeah. It's going, not as high in Western Europe, but it's all going that direction. We're all getting there.
Yeah. So my caution would be to people that if you have, just because you're skinny, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're cleared in that sense. However, if you are, and this comes back to the powers of CrossFit, is that if you can deadlift twice your body weight, if you can squat 1.5 times your body weight, you can run 10K, you sleep 8 hours a night, and you have we say at least a non-processed food diet, I think you're going to be pretty safe. And again, and your body, we say your body fat percentage is at the 15% mark somewhere. You're probably not going to have any big risk.
Yeah. In fact, one simple way. In fact, so for anyone listening, let me leave them with some practical point with what you're saying. If they don't have an access to a machine or a gym to tell their body fat, do two simple things. Get a measuring tape and measure around the fattest part around their belly. And if that number, and then measure height, and if the belly circumference doubled, so belly circumference times 2, if it's less than the number with height, then they're probably okay. Not always, but probably. If belly circumference times 2 is higher number than height, that's bad news. So time to go to a CrossFit gym. Time to go to Richard.
Yeah, you're welcome. I wanted to ask you for a book tip. I heard you said seek to understand and then to be understood. Steve Covey.
Yes. So he was a professor at my university.
Oh, really?
Yeah, BYU. Yep.
Yeah. So that is probably 7 Habits is probably one of the books that has opened up my eyes a lot to trying to understand people better.
Yeah, same. In fact, my dad had taken a class from Stephen Covey when he was a student here at this university years ago. And so we were raised with these ideas. And Richard, my dad, almost by himself, because my mom died when we were all quite young, my dad raised 13 children. And I will say, every child has a job, they have a family, and I do think not completely, but those principles in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, if someone hasn't read that, go read that book. And then, Richard, when they're done with that book, sometime next year, once it's translated into German, and we don't have a release date yet, but get my book, Why We Get Sick. It will be released in Germany, in German, sometime hopefully early next year. And it just is all about insulin resistance, how you get it, what are all the diseases that come from it, and then what to do about it, which is what we've been talking a lot about now.
Yeah, I'm very keen on getting my hands on the book. It's on pre-order right now and on Amazon, right?
Yep,
English
that's
version.
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm thinking of trying to digest that book, and I'll try to see if I can do a German recap of it
Awesome.
pretty soon, because I think it's a lot of, again, I think we need to have a bit louder voice when it comes to this. I know a lot of MDs simply are not enough educated on this topic.
That's right.
And they are mostly the people that are meeting these people with these disorders. So just to give them this nudge, like check, and like if we can have this whispering thing in their ear, like check your insulin.
Yep. It's a little voice.
Yeah. That might be very helpful. All right. Thank you, Ben, for participating in the show. And sorry for the loud background music.
No, it adds a certain mood to the conversation, Richard. It's wonderful. No, I had a great time. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I look forward to speaking to you somewhere in the future again, and maybe having you either back on a podcast, or if you are coming to Germany for book tours or so. We are also looking at actually having a bigger conference. We were looking at doing a bigger conference now this fall with for the fitness community in Europe, where we had very targeted knowledge about having a small micro gyms, but also coaching habits, and all that stuff. So maybe that would be an interesting thing to touch on in the future too. So
I'd love it. I'd love it. Yep. Please keep me in mind. Thanks again for the invitation. I had a great time.
thank you, Ben, and have a great day. Speak to you soon again.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.